Well, good morning. This is the third week in the row I have attended men's Bible studies. There was one in Austin, and then one in Dallas last week, and then this is my third one with the granddaddy of them all here in Lubbock. So it is good to be with you. And one of the things I've been so impressed about and encouraged by is that men have a desire to come together and to grow in their faith and how to live out that faith in their lives. I've seen it not just as something that we're doing because it's on the schedule, but because we really care about the Lord and we want to be men of God. And that's encouraging to me. I mean, the ladies are really good at this. They do this kind of thing all the time. In fact, we kind of laughed last week in Dallas. My sons and I attended that lectureship or that men's conference. And one of my sons and I came in kind of late. And as we came in, that room had a bunch of side, seats in it. And as we came in the room, what I noticed was every side seat in the place was full. And nobody was sitting in the middle. It's like we got to get so far away from one another, so that we just don't cramp each other's style. And I told them, if the ladies were doing a Bible study together, they'd be all right up here in these first two pews. And they'd be holding hands and we'd be singing and praying together all the time. But it's hard sometimes for us men to get into a situation where we say to one another and before one another and before God, I want to be changed. I want to be a man of God. I want to learn. I want to be different. Those are the kind of things that men have a challenge doing, particularly on our subject of the week, and that is when it comes to fear. I mean, how do you do a men's Bible study and tell guys, it's still cranking, so let it crank for a minute. Let's talk about our fears with one another. That seems to be a rather challenging kind of thing to get men to do. Or let's talk about our regrets. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that men really enjoy doing together. And yet, every person here has fears. Every one of us have regrets. And learning how to cope with those fears, deal with those fears, and overcome those fears, to have some courage to live for the Lord is going to be what we're going to try to do together this weekend. And so I hope that we'll be able to do that. We're going to do a little thing together that I've called fear mapping. And I think, does everybody have the sheet of paper that was handed out to you? All right. So GPT told me that those were the top reasons that men fear. You look through those. Those are the top reasons in our culture that men struggle with fears. And as you look through that and see the descriptions of each of those fears, what I want us to do together this morning to try to break through this idea that, hey, we all have fears. How are we going to let our fears not drive us into isolation or drive us into depression? How are we going to cope with our fears and replace them with some kind of courage to live for God? To do that, though, I want us to look at how these fears connect with one another. Because as you see them there, and this is kind of a list of them, or this is the list that you have on your piece of paper, we might have the idea that we have a lot of fears. But I want us to think about what are the connections between these fears. Do you see any connections that they have? Let's talk about them. Does anybody want to lead us off? Please speak loud and fast. What connections do you see between these fears?
Control plays a big part in all of them.
Very good.
A lot of that is beyond things we can control.
Yeah.
On the list itself, I think it applies a lot.
A lot of these. We just don't have control over a lot of them. That's right. Very good.
Well, it looks like it's a whole bunch of fears of life itself.
It is, isn't it?
From the time that you start mature until you die.
That's right. Life is full of fears. Can't ignore that. Let's look at the relationship ones. All right, let's look at the relationship. Which ones have to do with relationship? Well, intimacy, is that relationship? Okay, what else? Rejection. Okay. Man, well, a lot of these have relationship implications, don't they? So let's keep that in mind, that a lot of our fears have to do with relationships. Now, describe a little bit why relationships are fearful things. And there's back to control again, isn't it? Yeah. What else? Do we want relationships? Yeah. Ah.
Not only failure to yourself, but failure to the person that you're in the relationship with.
Man, can you relate to that? Failing the other person that you're in the relationship with. We are given roles of responsibility and roles of leadership in various aspects of our life. And when we let others down in those relationships, we fear that, don't we? Yeah, brother. That's right. Communication is hard.
We don't rely on a certain amount of communication.
Yeah.
We don't always, a lot of men are not that great at communicating very well.
Oh. Communication and control. Now, if I misspell anything, get over it, okay? You know what I'm trying to do. So, what are some other things? We see relationships. That's something that creates fear. When we break those relationships, we let those relationships down. We're not communicating well in those relationships. What other things create fear? Oh, expectations. I like that one. Yeah, my expectations, others' expectations. What's the connection here? What's this? What does that have to do with? What about time? Yeah, and then you saw another one in there, right? Death? Yeah, loss. Time problems. The loss of things. Can we control time? No. Wish we could. We can't control time. We have a difficult time controlling relationships. What about the connection between this? Oh, here's another health. This is a time thing, isn't it? Or we could call this another thing. This could be body. Some body limitations that we have. How about finances? And sometimes change. This may have to do with, what do you think the connection there could be? Boy, I love that one. Vulnerability. I think they need that one back up here. I don't know how to spell it, so it's going to be a V. That's what that's going to be. All right. Responsibility. Yeah, that's right. Insecurity. Man, you guys are coming up with some great things. And one of the things I had in my mind was stuff. We just don't have control over stuff. I don't have control over time. I don't have control over stuff. I don't have control sometimes how other people perceive me or my relationships with other people. It just seems as though that we've got a lot of connections with things that make us afraid, but they come down to some very fundamental things. We can't control our relationships, we can't control time, we can't control stuff. This makes us feel vulnerable. This makes us realize we don't have any control. Sometimes the responsibility we can't actually fulfill. Now, what I want to do is pivot for just a moment and think with you, how do you overcome those fears? Now, just act like you're not a Christian for a minute. How do people overcome those fears in their life? I'm so sorry? Outwork it. That's right. If I just try a little harder, I won't be afraid. I'll be able to control all these things. It's a big one. What's that called? That's called escapism. That's right. So what I'll do is, I've got all these things that make me afraid, and I just won't think about it. And if I don't think about it, especially take some drugs to help me not think about it, then they won't be there. Right? Ignore it. That's all right. That's a mental escapism. There's medical escapism. That's right. What other ways do people deal with it? Okay, now that's a very good thing to do. We first need to recognize the things that are causing us fear, and we need to work on it. No doubt. I'm so sorry, my friend. Oh, good. Yeah, if I get more busy, that's a form of escapism, isn't it? I won't have to worry about the things I'm afraid of. Now, what are we trying to do this weekend? Escapism is the answer there. No, that's not what we're trying to do this weekend. So Jesus, I'm going to suggest, is what we're seeking to find as the one who is the solution for those things that we fear. Why? How? How does he have the answers? Think about the problem of time. I'm getting older. I'm running out of time for my responsibilities, and I'm lacking. How does Jesus help us with time? Mm-hmm.
So therefore, what's my solution? Well, if you're in Christ, you understand that praying to Him and looking to Him for answers, through Him and the Spirit, you're going to find these answers. If it's available, they're going to be there.
So let's think about Jesus with regard to time particularly. Isn't he? That's right. Does the Alpha and the Omega have any problem with time? No. So we're all freaked out that we're not going to be able to get it done in time. And when we are faithful to the Lord, it's always going to be done in His time. So if we find our confidence in Christ, we don't have a problem with time. What about a problem with stuff? Does God need any stuff? If He needs any stuff, what can He do? He can just make it. He can change it. He can bring it to the point at which He needs it to work on. So let's think about another one. This is a challenging one. I have a lot of fears because of my relationships falling apart, and I don't have control over all of those. How does Jesus help with that? Love it. So Jesus can be a way in which I learn how to treat others that's going to solve that relationship problem. And it's also in His church that provides a place where I can have, to some degree, safe relationships, where I don't have to be so afraid. Like this morning. That's right. But how about if you've got a relationship, husband, wife, friend, neighbor, member of the church, it's just not going anywhere? You're going to live in fear of it all the time? How does Jesus help with a relationship that can't be mended? He's an example of how to face them. I'm going to keep my finger on that one, come back to that. That's a great thought. Yes. Reconciliation. Okay, so He provides reconciliation. What I'm thinking about is a relationship that's not reconciled. Someone who's hard and difficult and it doesn't change. You live your life in fear of that relationship is just not going to change. How does Jesus help with that? Yeah. You can't move forward? You can. Okay, help me with can't. Okay? Lord needed to do a work in you.
So, how can God keep working with me because He tells me I can't move forward if I don't love Him?
I get it. So the situation I'm envisioning is trying to live without fear when it's the other person that hasn't changed. If I need to change and deal with my fear, Jesus is going to help me do that. And that's an excellent point. But there's going to be circumstances in our life where the fear is just not going to go away. It's always going to be there. And relationships are some of that. There's some relationships that aren't going to change. If you live your life in fear of them not changing, it's just not, you're not going to deal with fear very well. But what's a relationship that is never going to go away? That's right. When you live faithfully to the Lord, you have a relationship with Him that doesn't go away. That's where you find your sense of safety and security. That's where you find your soul's longing for relationship to be realized. I'm going to come back to Jesus. Somebody said, look at Jesus as an example. Here He is in the Garden of Gethsemane. His culture is turned against Him. They're about to crucify Him. His own disciples are asleep. How about His relationships? Pretty torn apart. Not one He can rely on. But who does He have? He 3 times says, Father. It's a relationship that doesn't go away. Body problems. Anybody have a problem with health? Fear of sickness? Aging? How does Jesus help us with that? Okay. So is sickness and death a big deal to Jesus? Remember on earth? No problem with it, right? And what He has planned for these bodies, we've got to get out of the, I hurt today and I've got to fear for my body tomorrow, and know that what God has prepared for us in Jesus Christ is a glorified body that is like the glorified body of Jesus Christ. So what I'm wanting to suggest to us in this little icebreaker is that, first of all, I wanted us to at least all mentally, if not somewhat verbally, admit that we struggle with fears. And these fears limit us. Anybody ever have a problem sleeping because of a fear? Yeah. Anybody ever prayed so hard because of a fear? Yeah. Anybody ever just sit at home in isolation because you were afraid? Everybody ever paralyzed by fear? Now, if you're not shaking your head right now, well, you're just got enough self-control to keep it inside, is all that is. And if there's one thing that we can do as men together as we get into God's Word, is to admit that every one of us struggles with fear. But to recognize that we've got a tool to handle our fear that the world doesn't. And that is the Lord Jesus. And don't think simply that you have a bunch of fears and your fears are overwhelming and there's too many of them. No, they all boil down to the kind of things that Jesus has control over that we don't. And so we're going to learn to trust Him for it. All right. Well, does anybody have anything else they'd like to say before we turn it over to Chuck here? Yes, my friend.
I don't mean to generalize the list, but y'all already kind of said it.
Yeah.
I look at this list, and the first thing I thought of was Jesus has conquered all of it.
Love it. That's right.
There's a way He's done each one of them. Time won't tell for each one, but y'all covered something like it.
And that's the point we're trying to make. Jesus covers and controls all these fears. Thank you, my friend. Any other thoughts? All right. All right, Chuck, you ready, my friend?
Well, good morning. Good to be with you again. I was with you last year. I think I only did one breakout session. I got to enjoy listening to Terry Slack last year, but I sure enjoy my friend Tim. We've known each other a long time. Boyd and he both grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and so I can remember holding meetings when Boyd was over there, but Tim met in Texas connections, of course, Lubbock, because it's been a long time ago. I went to Tech many moons ago. Met Nate back in the early 90s, probably, wasn't it, when you first moved to West End? And so these guys, think about Sam was a college student. Now he's an elder in the Lord's church, and think about how time does move on. and what good work Milwaukee has done and become. And could never thought about that so many years ago at West End. Anyway, good to be with you. We're going to be looking, my part, at David. And my part's more going to be the regret side. I thought it was interesting to title something Living Without Regrets. How many of you have no regrets in life? Raise your hand. You know, the only person I think that would raise their hand is Willie Nelson. Wasn't there that song where he said, what can I do about it? If you really don't care about eternity, you don't care about where you stand before God, I suppose you could raise your hand and say, I don't have any regrets. But I don't think any of us who have an ounce of humility, who know we're going to answer to God for the kind of men that we've been in this life, could ever say, I have lived without no regret. Now, I hope what we can do is look at David about things that he did positively. We're going to see a lot of things that he did that were just not very good. And he brought a lot of stuff on himself. And when I look at David, and it's sort of like looking at the Apostle Peter, I think, that's me. I know what at least I'm not going through the same things, but I understand it, and I know what failure at times I've been in life. So when I think about that, as we talk about regretting, remember the Apostle Paul even said of himself, he was the chief or foremost of sinners. In 1 Timothy 1:12, he said, I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, an insolent man. But the thing that he talks about in that passage that he appreciated God for, he calls it, who was exceedingly abundant to me in his grace. When he looked at himself and he could think about all the bad things that he had been, it was really God's glory, God's grace, God's long suffering that Paul mentions in that passage too. And then he just breaks out into this great doxology of praise. We all live with regret. And so as I think about David this morning with you, the first part, I thought about his life. We're going to look at trials and sufferings that happened to him in the beginning. A lot of good things David does, but boy, when you open the pages and read it, there's just a lot of heartache that David experiences and a lot of difficult situations. The breakout session, if you choose to join that one, is going to be about our failures as fathers. David was a man after God's own heart, but I'm going to tell you, he made some really royal mistakes with his children. And because of that, he paid a terrible price. And you may find yourself there and things that you can learn from David. And then the last part's what I call David losing his way. I mean, when he goes to live among the Philistines, I don't know what else to call it. He had just lost his way to go live among the enemy. And we're going to talk in the last session about that. So we're going to be looking at chapters 18 through 23. Obviously, we can't read it at all. I was hoping that hopefully AJ mentioned the chapters to you and that you've read them already, but we will read some parts of them. So look with me in chapter 18 and at verse 1 through 5, we'll read together. I'm using the English Standard Version. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan, this was right after he killed Goliath, was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself to the robe that was on him and gave it to David, his armor, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. So what we see immediately in the story of David is that he has favor with Jonathan, who's the oldest son of Saul, who is the heir apparent to that kingdom where Saul's dynasty to continue. I mean, you get the sense that Jonathan falls in love with David as a man-to-man relationship instantly when he recognizes the great faith that was in David. Jonathan obviously must have been older than David to some extent. David is successful wherever he goes. We're going to see that over and again. Every time he goes out to fight the enemies of the Lord, he has more success than any of the others. And then all the nation loves him. I mean, at this point, there's nobody that is in disfavor or he's in disfavor with. But then you note at verse 6 what immediately happens. And as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of the cities, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang this song that you're going to hear in the life of David several times. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And what did that create in Saul? Immediately was jealousy. And so he eyed him, verse 9 says. What else could he have but the kingdom, if they're saying that about him? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. So let's think about this first thing that I think are challenges that we face in life. I'm going to ask questions, and I hope you'll help me answer them. What does jealousy lead us to do? What happens to us when we're jealous of someone? Pardon? Yeah, resent them immediately. We dislike them because of that, and we resent that they have whatever, the talent or what they possess or who they have a relationship with, and immediately we're in resentment of them. What else can it lead us to do?
We're going to sin a lot, and it don't matter what sin it is. You can be, it go to murder him, to steal from him, to covet what he has, to taking his wife away from him. Whatever you're going to do that you want to do against him because you don't like what you feel, you're going to sin against him.
And you move to that point of hating a person. I mean, you're diminishing them as being, in the eyes of God, a fellow human being, a fellow soul, and you instantly are centered upon them with that kind of idea of hate that it could motivate you to do a lot of things. Because what did it motivate Saul to do? What does Saul end up doing toward David? Yeah, he tries to kill him. I mean, on more than one occasion. If we went on and read it, he has his javelin or his spear, and he thinks to pin David to the wall, and he hurls that spear at David twice on this first occasion. I'm thinking, once is enough. If my boss hurls a spear at me, I think I'm just going to go find another job. Do it twice. I mean, first time I'm an idiot. The second time, what is it? I'm more than an idiot. I'm out of here. And it's not the only time that he tries to do that. Or you read a separate occasion where he tries to kill him again. He enlists all of his people to try to kill David. So yeah, the hatred can move you to do terrible things towards somebody. So when we think about jealousy and its impact on us, well, let's just take the first one. How should we handle jealousy in others toward us?
David never ceased to not love Saul and treat him as God's anointed king.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about David, he always looked to Saul differently than Saul looked toward him.
Yeah. If you go sometime and read, I think in that 2 Samuel chapter 1, where the Song of the Bow, where Saul and Saul and Jonathan and his sons die. That is a tremendous testament to David and the fact that he was willing to remember the good about Saul. There's so many lessons that we could go into, but I'm wanting to think about the ones about regret. But you think about how he was willing to love his master, his father-in-law, his king, and the fact that he was God's anointed. Yeah, that's a great point. What else? You think about what can we do to handle jealousy of others toward us? Sam. Go
I
ahead.
think it's really easy to turn it back, even if you're not necessarily going to return jealousy for jealousy. The suspicions, the resentment, the evil, you can start engaging in a really quickly escalating tit for tat that gets out of control.
Right. Two people can't even be in the same room together,
So,
and it's palpable. The rest of us can feel it.
yeah, so being able to do
Yeah.
He's going to be a peacemaker as much as he can.
And you think about this is one area of his life that I don't think he had to ever live with regret. I think he did the right thing from the get-go about Saul. He had that attitude that you're talking about. Justin.
I'm reminded of a time when David is hiding in the cave from Saul, and
Yeah.
Saul, by happenstance, goes to relieve himself
Right.
in the cave, and David cuts off the corner of Saul's garment. And then Saul is leaving the cave, and David addresses Saul and says, God delivered you in my hand, I spared you. And in that, this might be wrong, but how should we handle jealousy? I almost feel like you should address it. Identify it first and address it in a way of, hey, let's come together as equals, almost how David did. And Saul, almost being humbled in that time, leaves David alone.
Yeah.
He was pursuing him, trying to find him and kill him. And that was his purpose of being in the wilderness. And when David addressed it, Saul left him alone.
We're not very good about that, are we? About addressing a problem. You know, Paul talks about us, as much as lies within you, live at peace with all men. There are going to be some men you cannot live peaceably with. I mean, that's just a reality, and Saul was one of them. But as much as lay in David's power, he was going to try. And he always did. I mean, it hurt his conscience. He had cut that corner of the robe. And he came out and he talked to his father-in-law and said, what have I done? And I've only ever done good. Jonathan tried to tell his father the same thing. But Saul was one of those irascible, he's not thinking about God, he's not living like he ought to do, that you could not live with it, you know, at peace. And so David has to do what we'll talk about in a minute. So what about how should we handle jealousy in ourselves toward others? What does the Bible tell us about that? Put it away. I'm going to tell you, if God is central with us, then when jealousy, and I'm going to tell you folks, jealousy is going to strike your heart. You don't think there's jealousy with preachers? You know, Nate, all of us know. And how it can be so bad at times. When you think God is the one that gives ability, and God is the one that chose to pick David as a man after his own heart. And you think about how we can let that consume us, and it will. And the Bible simply says sometimes it's just, we don't need, I'm not saying there's no place for counseling in our lives, but sometimes, folks, the Bible just tells you, stop it, quit it. I mean, put it away from you. If we would remember that, the moment it strikes our heart, it would help us. It would do a lot. One of the things David does in this story, and it's a question that I have, because he throws the javelin at him. Having trouble getting it to go forward. There we go. And one of the things David does, that you remember Michal helps him, and Michal even loves him, Saul's daughter, and helps him escape. Jonathan helps him escape. I mean, he has to escape. You read the life of David, and he's a constant fleeing. I mean, he is fleeing almost the whole time. So is it ever right to flee in the face of trials and sufferings? Yeah.
Butt naked, but he was still ran.
Yeah. There are times, aren't there? And I think that's what, you find it in a number of other places in Scripture. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, this is the New Testament, Joseph, in a dream, said, rise, take the child, his mother, and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Even God told people to flee. In fact, he tells his apostles in Matthew 10:23, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. So I think there's a part of us as men, and I know I have this danger all the time, is that if I'm facing trouble with someone else, and they're the cause of what I think is unjustified criticism, and attacking me. What's usually what most of us as men want to do? Yeah, I know. I'd rather be Clint Eastwood than than be what the Lord just told me to do. I mean, I want to be John Wayne. I mean, let's just go knock them in the face and flatten them on the ground and, deal with it direct. And that's not always the way God wants us to handle the situation. And how are you going to know? Sometimes we got to stand, act like men, the passage in 1 Corinthians. But how do you know when you ought to do this? I'm sorry?
When it starts to affect your mental health.
Thank you. Help me if I don't hear something. When it starts to affect your mental health, okay? That's a good point.
When the first way to handle it doesn't work, this seems like the proper second advantage that we have.
You ever see in movies and you have an older guy and he might be his son and somebody gets in their face and really lays down the gauntlet. It's the young guy that wants to punch him out. The old guy's always sometimes, putting his hand up. He's still smiling. He's talking to the enemy. And I'm going to tell you what answers what all of you have said, the two of you have answered, is wisdom comes by life. And listen, God's not going to come down and tell us to go flee, right? But we have examples, and we know that he did. So I know that's an option. But life's going to have to explain that. Wisdom that you get, and sometimes it's time. The mental health thing that somebody was mentioning a minute ago. So I thought that was interesting in the life of David, that sometimes living without regret is going to demand that we flee, and the other aspect of that is you're depending on God. That was the constant refrain of David's life. I'll protect you. I'll take care of you. But we want to act. We want to do something. And David's going to make a lot of mistakes because he did that. Okay, I don't know why it's not advancing. Now it advances a bunch. Okay, how should we handle reactions to suffering? Go over to chapter 20 and look with me. So David fled from Naioth. He had been with Samuel in Ramah, and he came and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said, "Far be it from you, you'll not die. My father doesn't do anything without disclosing it to me." And David says to him in verse 3, "I'm telling you, your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes," and he thinks, "Don't let Jonathan know." But truly, at the end of that verse, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And so David is laying out what I think exposing his heart to Jonathan about all of this turmoil of trial and suffering that he's going through with his father. And I think the very first thing he says is the thing that often happens with us, is he looks at Jonathan and he says, "What have I done?" When really bad trials and sufferings hit your life, and I can think, especially when we think of being persecuted because we're doing the right thing, what's our first reaction to that? What's generally our first reaction?
Why?
Yeah, why? Shock. I mean, this is my Father's world, we sing. This is God's world. So when we suffer as good guys, as doing the right thing, I think that we instantly go to the idea of just being shocked. Look over in 1 Peter 4 and verse 12. He warned the brethren there because they could think that, and he warned them about that in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12. "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial which comes upon you to test you as though some strange thing were happening to you." I mean, the first thing God tells us is, it's the way this world is. It's the way that the two kingdoms that are pitted against one another is going to be, and it's working its way out in this world. So particularly if we're being persecuted for righteousness' sake, but I think we all no matter what we're facing in trial and suffering, we think, why? And the shock of it. I think David's second statement that he makes to Jonathan is he says, what is my guilt? And I take it this direction. I'm thinking, not necessarily that David was thinking that, but I'm thinking this idea of, after I'm being hurt and persecuted or whatever's happening to me, can that not give you a tendency to think, then maybe I'm wrong? Maybe I am wrong. Okay, I've got 15. And so we have to think about that. I think about David doubting himself when he says to him that I have but a step between me and death. I mean, he had been fleeing and fighting against all of this. And so we can think we're utter failures. Well, there it goes. And then the last one I think that happens in this story is at verse 41, David gets up and bows before Jonathan, and they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. When things happens in life, when we have trials and tribulations, when there's jealousy in people, when churches get divided from one another, when brethren are divided individually from one another, you're always going to have loss of relationship. Some of the things that you were talking about earlier. I don't know, there are people in my life that I'm even kin to that I can't, there's no reconciling it. As much as you try on your part to live peaceably with all men, there's no making it right. That relationship is broken, like it was between David and Saul. Not because that's what David wanted, but because the other side's not going to move. They're not going to budge. They're not going to do right. And the sooner that we can somehow come to grips with that and realize that that's going to be the case, I'm going to find friends that are not going to do that. And I'm going to always depend on what Tim said a minute ago, that God is never going to move from me. God, cast all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Fear not, for I will never leave you nor forsake you, in Hebrews 13 and verse 5. So I think about David in regard to that. Okay, anything you might want to comment on? I want to move to one last thing that we'll do. Anything that might...
So God even helps the door with David. This should be something we're praying for in our fears, any fears, is God to close and open doors so that we're led in his way in the areas we can't see or that we can't figure out. Some of it has to do with looking at the Bible. Some of it has to do with events and how those events unfold and what we should do at those moments that we need wisdom for. With David, he even has Saul say, God opens that door where he can at least not be in such fear of King Saul, because Saul ends up saying, you're so much better than me, and he leaves him alone basically, so that he's not in jeopardy of the pursuit constantly that he had survived for several years before that.
Yeah.
The other thing is it takes a long time for things to work sometimes.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's not always the answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's on down the line. And that's really difficult to be patient through those things.
It is. One of the points we're going to get to and look at is the Bible tells us to wait on the Lord. We're Americans, and there's nothing about us that wants to wait. It has been this constant pursuit across a continent, conquering, moving, always moving, mobile. Something's better. We can work it out. And to think about somebody saying to us, wait on the Lord, and that it may take a long time. And it did. He always was there. He was always protecting David. Sometimes, you remember there was that one account where Saul comes around one side of the mountain, and he's coming around the other side, and they're about to pincher, David in the middle, and the blast comes and says the Philistines have attacked the land, and Saul has to retreat. And it doesn't say God did that, but God did that, right? He saved him in the right, almost got him. How many times almost got him being in that cave, that close? But David was always protected. So yeah, and so the point you're making is a really good point, about that. One last thing I wanted to look at this story is towns turned against him. Keilah was one of them. The Ziphites were another. He had brethren, Judean brethren, his people, turn against him. I'll tell you that's a hard thing in life. As much as jealousy, when somebody turns against us in our life, how do we not grow bitter and despise them for that? That is a hard thing. Because you're going to have brethren turn against you sooner or later. You're going to have somebody, you're going to have somebodies. And again, it's what you said a minute ago, Justin. Put away bitterness, put away, all those ill feelings, maliciousness, all of that in Ephesians 4. Rather love them, forgive them, as Christ, forgave us, as God forgave us in Jesus Christ. And unless we keep that central, we'll be eaten up either by jealousy or bitterness or hatred or, being mistreated by other people. And David could have well gone there. All right, how much more time do I got? 10 minutes. I have 10 minutes? Okay, good. All right, any thoughts to this point?
I
Yep.
was just going to say one other thing that David does. I kind of see some of it. I know it could be rhetorical when he's asking, what have I done? When he's asking Jonathan that. But one thing we're not going to regret is if we do a little looking inwardly before we start reacting or running away or anything to see, is there something I am doing that is part of this problem? Now, there wasn't anything David was doing that was part of the problem, but that's actually a good thing for us to stop and do. Sometimes we are contributing to this problem. Maybe not justly, but we can look and see what we can do. That goes back to your first point, changing what we can change about it, controlling it. That's going to take some looking at.
Yeah. Sam was saying that sometimes we are at fault. We need to look inside first. It's going to be my lesson Sunday night about, we're going to look at some other failures of David's life. But one of the points we're going to make is that point, is that David seemed to always first try to look within himself. And utterly the opposite of Saul. Saul's blaming other people, Well, the people brought her the best of the flocks from the Amalekites, and it was always somebody else to blame. But David was always, and I'm not saying that he didn't have a process to go through. For a year he fights against God with the, sin of Bathsheba. But when Nathan tells him that story, he doesn't take Nathan's head off. He says, "Thou art the man." He said, "I have sinned against God." And he takes assessment of himself. If we're going to be true men of God, man, that is so important. How many times do you see people and guys gather the wagons when we are accused of doing something wrong and circle them and defend ourselves? I always say the moment that you are told that you are in the wrong is the most critical second that you'll ever spend in your life, is what you do with it right then. And if you are able to look at that person and assess it in your mind and know they're right, to whatever extent, and sometimes it may be that, there's some crow you eat to say that, you are going to benefit your heart and the hearts of other people if you will just simply say in that moment, you're right. That's what I did. And admit it. And I think David shows us how there's a reason God says to him, in spite of all these failures and things that he could have regretted, it still says to us he was a man after God's own heart. And not many people in the Bible that's said about. But he was. He was a man after God's own heart. And that's a great point. Anything else? David does something that we're going to get to in the next lesson, or the third lesson. And he flees to the Philistines in this first round too, because obviously that's going to get him away from Saul. It doesn't go well because they cite that song. Is not this a song of the guy? And David, remember, he must have been a really good actor. And so he feigns like he's insane. He lets drool go down on his beard. He claws at and the guy's like any politician, I think, he says, do I not have enough madmen working for me that you bring me another one? And David realized he had made a really bad mistake by going to the enemy, and he's going to have a worse one that we'll look at in the last lesson. But again, I think it's that deal about we are so prone to try to fix our own problem. He sort of had gotten to the point that he just felt like that's the only answer. I've got to go to the Philistines, which was a bad move. And we'll talk in the last lesson about how that is that we could flee to the enemy too. But let me close with Psalms 130, and then we'll take our break or whatever the next step is in this. But turn over with me, if you will, to Psalms 130, and I'll close with this. It's a song of ascents. Songs of ascents were, they believe, the songs that the pilgrims, as they came to the 3 annual feasts, sang on their way. You remember, this is at the top of the geography where the temple is, so they were usually from any other place in the land of Palestine ascending. They were heading up. And so this song of ascent begins with, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than watchmen in the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. What does this writer say to you? What are things that you do when you have the urge to fix your own problems? The very first thing is, what does he do? I heard your voice, and out of the depths I prayed to you. That we take our problem to God first. That we remember to do that day in and day out if it's something we are continually fighting. That we hear his voice. How many times throughout this that he talks about listening to the Lord. That he assesses himself. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? With you there is forgiveness. If he has sinned against God, then he wants to plead for that forgiveness. Then that idea of waiting that we talked about, we'll elaborate on that more at the end of the lesson. And that he hopes in the Lord and in his steadfast love for his people, and that he is full of redemption, the ability to turn something around. And that's exactly what he's done in our life, to make us people that walked against him to become people that are like his son. Is as great a creative act as anything that he speaks out of it, nothing into existence. So I always thought that was a great chapter when you think about the things it tells us positively to do. Okay, thank you for listening